I'd like to talk about the difficulties of EU fiscal policy coordination, focusing on the coordination of fiscal stimulus policies, particularly in 2009, 2010. And with coordination of fiscal policies, I'm talking about the establishment of agreed rules of the game in the macroeconomic spheres that then constrain or even determine fiscal policy instruments and outcomes. And next slide. So the starting point is the idea that the modern welfare state is very much haunted by a debt and deficit bias, the idea that policymakers just can't help themselves. They accumulate debt, and they like to enter an unsustainable path as far as fiscal policy is concerned. And so this is a very old idea, and already in 1997, when policymakers, EU-wide and national policymakers, thought about the construction, the architecture of EMU, they came up with a response to this, and that was the Stability and Growth Pact. We've already talked about this today, and I don't really need to go into detail. If you're really interested in it, you should read Amy's 2010 book. But if you want to remember two things about the Stability and Growth Pact, then you should remember that it has a 3% of GDP deficit ceiling, and that it is ineffective. So that's not new. Here we can see that even prior to the burst of the bubble, to the eruption of the financial and economic crisis in 2008, debt levels were creeping up, and creeping up. So the idea is very much that it was not working, and that member states pretty much did what they wanted. And we thought that, okay, it's not working because member states, they hate the idea of having a ceiling. Sure, there's the deficit and debt bias, and member states like to run high deficits because that's how you pay for votes. And given this, you would then think that fiscal policy coordination in times of crisis is really faced with a dilemma, because when would you spend money if not in times of crisis? And the European Commission was actually quite quick to realize this. Member states responded with their own initiatives. Even prior to the December 2008 summit, when the European Economic Recovery Plan was announced, member states had already came up with announcement of their plans, what they wanted to do. And so then actually the Commission was quite behind the curve in finally coming up with a plan that was the EERP, announcing that it would call for a budgetary impulse amounting to 200 billion euros, so 1.5% of EU GDP. The vast bulk of it was to come from the member states, 1.2%, and then 0.3% of the EU itself. So far, so good. We have the situation where member states actually like to spend money, and hooray, in times of crisis, actually, the EU gives them a carte blanche, gives them an encouragement to spend money, to spend their way, Keynesian style, out of a recession. And what you get? You get this. And this is very much member states doing what they wanted to do, doing what they had planned to do in any event. And none of the people I interviewed from the Commission, from the Council, from the permanent representatives of the member states, from the European Parliament, none of them said that this European Economic Recovery Plan made any difference to the fiscal responses to the crisis. And it's not surprisingly, given member states' vastly different interests and economic possibilities, and also the effects of the crisis, that these responses varied widely and very considerably so. And here I think is one of the interesting facts of the crisis. That is that member states not only don't like to be told that they should not run a high deficit, member states actually don't like to be told at all how to run their fiscal policies. So the problem of fiscal policy coordination is not that there's a ceiling, is not that there's a 3%. The problem is that member states can't agree on what fiscal policy should look like, of what good fiscal policy constitutes of. And here, of course, now we have a new problem just emerging, with France being in election mode and François Hollande and Merkel looking likely to fight over what is the right response for 2012, whether it would be austerity or whether it would be more stimulus, more growth. And here we have a classic collective action situation where we are almost unable to achieve group-oriented behavior because of a high heterogeneity of interests and also of ideas. So then, one interesting question would be, what drove fiscal stimulus policies during the crisis? And here it's interesting to see that actually GDP growth, so the amount to which member states' national economies were affected by the crisis, that doesn't really matter so much. Look at the 2009 graph. The correlation between fiscal stimulus and GDP is almost negligible. However, in 2010 then, slightly different picture. And here for the EU as a whole, it's almost negligible with a correlation of not even 0.09%. And this, interestingly, is almost irrespective of the ideological outlook of the government. So this comes somewhat as a surprise if you think about the idea of, oh yeah, it comes from Hibbs, 1970s, there are the left governments and the right governments, and some of them really like to spend a lot, and others think that you should be fiscally very, very prudent. And this would chime in with the rhetoric, particularly of the German government, where they very much presented themselves as the harbingers of stability culture and of being fiscally prudent. But then if you look, maybe let's look back at the numbers. Germany actually had quite a considerable stimulus, as well as in total numbers and in percentage of GDP. So again, it's such a diverse group, and the crisis has fueled the diversity, the differences between the economies, and also then, of course, their needs to respond to very different challenges. So the crisis has aggravated the situation where EMU member states have a hard time to agree on what should fiscal policy look like. And a similar picture, then, again interesting, emerges as far as fiscal stimulus and unemployment is concerned. The link there between the two, the correlation. We have something that we would not automatically assume, because what's fiscal policy there? What's a fiscal stimulus there? It's there to help a situation where you have a lot of unemployment. But actually the relationship is a reverse one, where you have the more unemployed people you have in an economy, the less high the fiscal stimulus responses have actually been. That's somewhat counterintuitively. And here the graph gets a bit muddled, but a similar situation for the EU as a whole. This then comes to, this leads me to the third candidate of what we would all expect. What about debt levels? So we have three candidates. We have GDP, unemployment, and debt levels. And here, with debt levels, I think we're onto something. We're onto this separate and select incentive that Olsen talks about as actually the only real possibility to jolt a group that is marked by high latency into collective action. And here what you see is what happened very much in 2009, 2010. That was the member states who had high debt levels. It's then indicative of an unsustainable path for public finances. So the member states who had these high levels, they engaged in less stimulus spending. And this actually is not a matter of the size of automatic stabilizers. The correlation between stimulus spending and automatic stabilizers is almost negligible, as you can see here by the weighted markers for stimulus spending. However, interestingly, if we take the EU as an ensemble together, this relationship, not much, correlation almost negligible. So let's move to the real numbers here. And I want to draw your attention to the correlation between the Eurozone and non-Eurozone and the stimulus with the debt levels. And what you see here is that for the non-Eurozone member states, there was a positive relationship between debt levels and stimulus. However, for the Eurozone member states, there was a very negative relationship, and quite a large coefficient as well. In other words, for the Eurozone member states, it mattered. It mattered whether they had high debt levels. They realized that high debt levels means that you don't have much fiscal space. That's the jargon of the European Commission. They don't have much fiscal space to really do much about it. And that, of course, leads me then to the real sheriff in town, and that is market pressures, which have been awoken by the economic and financial crisis, and with the start of EMU, with the start of the introduction of the euro. Of course, we heard that earlier before, almost all Eurozone participants, they were treated as if they were equals, which, of course, they are not. And then what we see here is then market pressures being back in town and very much regulating fiscal policy and what is going on, and the debt level is only indicative as such, as this is one of the main indicators for fiscal space, for fiscal sustainability. And here, this might be just a peek into the future. The planned changes in government deficits over the 2010 and 2014 period, where the EU as a whole is predicted to come back to 1.4% of deficit. So these are only plans, and who knows what might happen within the next 2 years. But I still think that this is a sign of some sort of coercion, of some form of consolidation taking place, and of member states being convinced that this is actually what they need to do. And I don't think that this is because they agree on fiscal policy any more than they have done prior to the sovereign debt crisis. I believe that this is due to the constraints, to separate and selective incentives that are enforced by market participants. So then, where are we heading with all this? Are we heading towards fiscal union, a divorce, or just muddling through? Again, maybe just 3 brief points. It has been well established in the literature that fiscal policy coordination did not work prior to the crisis. And based on the different stimulus plans, as far as their size and their content is concerned, I don't think that fiscal policy coordination did work during the crisis. However, I believe that fiscal policy might just work better after the crisis. And I'm not suggesting here that market pressure, that this is some form of panacea. But luckily, there are proposals on the table who might mitigate these very market pressures, who are able to somehow alleviate the high group latency of EMU member states, that these market pressures might actually be softened by various proposals, and here we go along the lines of Eurobonds and so forth, to actually make this work. Because the Eurozone needs a sheriff to tell them what to do in terms of fiscal policy, and that's the only way to achieve fiscal policy coordination. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for still being here. I know with the rain of yesterday and the sun today, the tendency to want to go out, I'm sure, is tremendous at this point. Thanks also for David for inviting me back for another opportunity to be here. I think I negotiated this title, or I was given the title, I don't exactly remember. But when I was thinking of a general conference with people from all walks of life, I thought this is probably the most boring talk to give at the very end of a very lively 2-day session. So with your permission, the paper actually moved quite far away from the very narrow talk, even though I've left it on the top of the presentation. In principle, what I'd like to do is to speak a bit more broadly. But before I do so, let me just wake you up a little bit with some pictures, which is always good at the very end of a conference. Here we have Greece bearing the weight of its debt. We have the euro crumbling, euro whining bankers, Europe castle in the sky, and the emu there, the little bird that can't fly. And then our great fear of euro domino. I think we're at the Spanish part at this point, I suppose. And then this is a picture of some time ago, Merkel and belt tightening in Greece. This is the commoner in Greece, Papandreou, and of course Merkel. So what I thought to do today is to talk briefly about what kind of economic and monetary union was created, look at the triggers that we have for the issues of today, what have been some of the academic responses to EMU, then the EU responses, and then turn to some lessons from integration, what have we been trying to do to solve the euro debt crisis, and then come to the conclusion which is in line with the topic of our panel here right now. So what kind of EMU was created, or what kind of euro area? And I think the whole vision of single currency was to have an economic and monetary union that could be created along the lines of what was feasible at the time. Obviously, we've documented very well in many of the talks, but also in the literature, it was asymmetrical in the sense that it had a very well-developed monetary policy, and it was much less well-developed in the economic domain along the lines of what was in the Werner plan with the coordination of economic, budgetary, fiscal policies. So on the monetary side, we did, of course, have the free movement of capital, referred to earlier in the day, regulation of national central banks, however, still done by the national central banks, the regulation on the the banking sector supervision of financial markets was national, but at the European level we saw monetary policy, so the setting of interest rates and the determining of the amount of money supply. But as much as we at the time looked at this literature, it said we had full monetary integration and only imperfect economic integration, and the previous speaker highlighted what that meant. It was like decentralized through rules. What we have sort of not picked up on at the time was that even the monetary part wasn't fully transferred to the EU level. So it was a narrow understanding of central banking that focused on setting rates. It was really ERM plus kind of thing that we were doing, but it wasn't the full role of the central bank. So when the crisis first happened, the ECB actually didn't have the data to know which companies were having a difficult time, which banks were having a difficult time, exactly how they were financed. That data wasn't made available to the ECB. So monetary, central bank with a focus on sort of the interest rates, but not on the entire supervisory part. Economic, it was the single market coordinated budgetary fiscal policies, but not really centralized. So the main mode of regulation of the sort of the fiscal side was through the treaty, so the provisions in the treaty that stated about keeping the economies as a matter of common concern and coming up with rules on budgetary deficits, further clarified in the Stability and Growth Pact. So an understanding was there from the very outset that this was an imperfect arrangement for integration, but that adjustments would occur when needed. Okay, what have been obviously the recent triggers? So first of all, the financial crisis, then the economic crisis, now the sovereign debt crisis. But I would also like to highlight the rise of Euroscepticism, the lack of deeper public support. Financial crisis obviously being, depending on who you are and what you want to emphasize, something that started in 2007 or in 2008, depending on the size and what you're focusing on. Those people looking at credit crunch always highlight 2007. Those people look at stocks coming down like you wouldn't believe and people tumbling and so on, focus typically on 2008. Economic crisis defined as sort of GDP coming below zero per capita, annual GDP growth, typically 2009. Sovereign debt crisis, depending again on who you are and when you're speaking about, starts either with the Greek announcement of the budgetary deficit being higher than expected in the fall, or the fact that the EU comes up with this May 2010 decision to facilitate the problems that Greece has through European arrangements, and I would argue we're still going on. I do not put in a euro crisis. People who emphasize that there's a euro crisis going on, I always send them back and I say, I have nothing to say on the euro crisis. I don't see any crisis of the euro. The euro hasn't completely plummeted. Of course, this month it's a little bit different, but in principle, the euro has stayed remarkably stable. So where a euro crisis comes in, it would be those people who look at all of this and say, this now fundamentally undermines the euro area. And I'm still not of the opinion that we're undermining the euro area. All of this is causing the EU as a whole and the euro area within it serious concerns, but I'm not sure I would like to qualify it that way. Maybe in about a month or two I will revisit this slide. The rise of Euroscepticism I put on here in part because of the slides that are to follow, which have to do with how do we solve some of these issues. So part of this is, in my view, the crisis. So what we see since the start of the whole, again, this is one of the next slides, but what we see with the citizens of the European Union increasingly having less permissive consensus about European integration, a less permissive consensus about national leaders representing them at the EU level and seeing that the EU is doing the right thing, whatever that may mean, creates a situation in which finding a solution is more complicated than initially anticipated. When we were on that first slide talking about integration is imperfect, at some point a next step has to come. So this sort of the crisis of permissive consensus of the European public is another, if you like, element to be considered under the recent triggers. So what have been some of the academic responses to EMU? It's very interesting that people like Feldstein in 1992 and 98, and again with the crisis again, highlighting that EMU will lead to war. We we kind of always laughed at him in the beginning, and we're now not laughing as loudly. But his argument is that if you have an arrangement of single currency without a proper fiscal federalist arrangement, you in the extreme case will have war or some form of alienation amongst the participants. Eichengreen, in an article that came out recently in JCMS that overlooked the whole period backwards, highlights the imbalances in the euro area, and a number of the previous presentations have put the slides up about competitiveness and what have you. And then Paul de Grauw, in a paper that's been floating as a working paper and is forthcoming in JCMS in November, has highlighted that the EMU countries are now becoming like emerging economies. The argument there is, if you are the United Kingdom and you have a debt, you could sort of have people leave your currency, invest in somebody else's debt, there will be a downward pressure on your currency and somebody else has something else to buy. If you are in the euro area and you're worried about the debt, you can get exactly the same debt in exactly the same denomination somewhere else, so there's absolutely no risk. You're not needing to diversify, you just put it in somebody else's debt. Subsequently, there's no downward pressure on your currency because it's actually the same currency, you've just moving it to somebody else's debt. So that these sort of corrections that we have seen typically in public debt, we don't see in sovereign debt. Just to remind you, sovereign debt is defined as public debt denominated in a foreign currency, and as Gabrielle also said earlier today, a euro currency for a nation state is a foreign currency, right? Because you cannot issue your own debt, you can't issue your own money. It's denominated in somebody else's currency, the collective currency that you partly own, but it's not the same as the United Kingdom having public debt that it can issue and it can print and so on. So in a sense, EMU countries are in a different situation when it comes to their public debt than are countries that are in the EU but not in the euro area. Okay, so what has the EU done? Well, in response to the financial crisis, the response was very, very slow. We saw nation states falling over each other trying to respond. Again, in the economic crisis, we saw mostly national responses. And in the sovereign debt crisis, we've seen, I think the part that we are most interested in here in the past 2 days, we've seen a response on the part of the nation states that highlighted the core of what economic and monetary union had been all about. So countries like Germany, and Germany like-minded countries, had been concerned about bailouts from the very first day. So when there was an opportunity to say, you know, there's a problem in this case in Greece, and a solution would be a bailout or to make money available, this was at the heart of the problems that the Germans and German like-minded countries had been thinking about all along. So for them, the solution wasn't, this is what we need to do because obviously we need to do this. No, this is a design failure. And in order to help Greece out, one first has to make a lot of design changes, and therefore it could not be done fast. It was not, oh, we don't see that this is a problem. It was, if we solve it right away, we would miss that step of design correction, which we've known all along, that when this happens, we will need to redesign. And because they couldn't agree on what it was or how, and that's why it escalated to a larger extent. But of course, in the end, bailout was necessary, and we've seen some of the changes. Now, the rise of Euroscepticism is another point where I think we've seen concerns. So when the Constitutional Treaty and subsequently the Lisbon Treaty was being negotiated, the problem of the lack of people's support made that it was very difficult for the EU to respond to this crisis with the big, great vision thing. When Economic and Monetary Union was set up and people looked at it, as I mentioned on my very first slide, it was clear that at some point somebody would have to do the big vision thing. Okay, so now monetary union is great, it just has this minor imperfection, and now we will just understand and explain to the people why further or deeper integration is necessary, and therefore maybe more fiscal or more taxes or more, you know, transferring sovereignty. In the rise of Euroscepticism and the lack of sort of permissive consensus, it's very difficult for nation states to come up and say, I have this great vision, I know how you're supposed to do it, this is what we're going to do. Now, so recent developments have therefore, in my view, stuck very closely to what we already know. Because the vision thing is scary to nation-state leaders. So the Pact and the new Fiscal Stability Treaty are, if you like, are incrementally in the same logic as that what was there before. So they, again, requiring things like, you know, balanced budgets. I mean, that I think is a large step. but things like fines for not complying, it is sort of Stability and Growth Pact plus, and a bit stronger and more serious, but it isn't the great vision thing, if you like. So what are some of the lessons from European integration? Obviously, we're in the middle of a major crisis, but I'd just like to remind all of you who have not, who are younger than me and myself, and all of us who are not 20 years older than we are now, that the EU has done this all the time, right? So we've gone through a crisis around the United Kingdom coming into the European community, the empty chair crisis, Eurosclerosis of the 1970s and 80s, difficulties around the Maastricht Treaty, even the run-up to EMU. Everybody will look at it and say, oh, well, that was major readjustments, but everybody got there. There was the glory 1990s. On an EMU perspective, like if you had to make snapshots, there was very rarely a moment where everybody said, oh, this EMU is really on track. It was really good. I remember giving a presentation to a group of people when I was at the University of Essex, and my slides that came from the European Monetary Institute, which had made 2 annual reports, and it had this beautiful graph with this one square of this one country that complied, and it was Luxembourg. So 400,000 people represented by a government complied with all the convergence criteria, and this was sort of 1994, 95, 96. So I mean, if one thinks of the EU today as having terrible trouble because we're not doing so well, that's the status quo in the EU. It's just a bit more majestic this time around than it was in previous versions, I would argue. But maybe those who sat through the Eurosclerosis of the 1970s would argue differently. Now, what have we done in terms of the topic I was supposed to speak about, so the Stability and Growth Pact? I don't want to speak too much as my time is rapidly depleting, but I think the Stability and Growth Pact was there as a mechanism to enforce the discipline and the coordination that could not be agreed to as an integrative project with delegated powers. So it was a sort of create the structure and have everybody do it. But then, as some other people have already highlighted earlier today, that didn't quite work well. And of course, it's the big irony of life that it was Germany, among others, Germany and France, in fact, and Portugal. But Portugal, we would have forgiven. It's Germany and France that we don't forgive, who failed to comply, and then it had to be reformed. And then after that, it was just not felt to be taken so seriously. I would argue, if you actually look at it, it was never off the agenda. People just never picked it up. It wasn't big in your screen, but it was still there. Then, of course, we have the reform in 2011. Thank you. So I will skip this one then. So solving the euro debt crisis. So what have been some of these solutions that can be put forward? So the less integration, the do-nothing option is most likely, in my view, a recipe for a collapse of something. So either the euro area or other horrific kind of scenarios that could disintegrate the euro area or the EU as we know it today. It may not necessarily be a bad thing. I've spoken to many economists who argue that this would be the best thing on earth for Greece, not the people that we saw here this morning and yesterday night, but other economists happily will tell me anytime that this is what you would do in other countries, and why not in Greece. But I think the more integration is, in my opinion, the safer route to get there. And some of the things that we've done are, the enhancing some of the EU facilities for providing finance, developing economic governance further, and now considering steps towards deeper political and fiscal integration. Now, I think in today's environment, maybe following also what Henrik had said about, one was hopeful that what has been done would have been enough. I think in the current environment, one looks around and says, well, it's not convincing that everything that needs to be done has been done. So there is a need for deeper political and fiscal integration, and to also consolidate the decisions that have been made. From my point of view, I think the really difficult challenges are to find the right type of European response while staying united. So coming back to the very early point I made, my concerns are, how does one communicate this to the people in a way that the people feel that the governments of the European Union are united, that this two-level game that is being played by many nation-state governments becomes a sort of a not cool thing to do, because it's in the interest of the EU as a whole to try to come through this. So even if there are national differences, that the elites will stop playing this game of, I said so, and then he said so, and then she made me do this, and so on, that there's a bit more of a coherent feeling amongst the leadership. That leadership structure will not be created right away in the EU in such a way that it would be a dynamic, integrated Europe with its structure with a clear leadership at the top. So it will remain this messy leadership, messy democracy, in part because Europe was built on the ruins of the Second World War. We do not want one leader telling everybody what to do. It's just not the way to go. But it means that if you have this other structure where you are in a sense of coordinated leadership, it needs a sort of a socialization of the leadership of what that then means in terms to lead with many heads. And the sort of bad-mouthing each other and pointing fingers is just not the way forward. And that's very important because if that is not done well, these leaders who are sort of the ones that are in power will very quickly be overtaken by others who are in the wings waiting to become leaders who will play that card out, in which case national leaders will end up wanting to get those voters and in so doing speak much more, I don't know, nationalistic or anti-European or anti-another country. So I think that's one of the challenges we see. So coming to a conclusion, I think the economic indicators of today show the limits of the institutional design of economic and monetary union and the European Union as such. So the asymmetry has been brought to the test. The lack of political leadership in this sense, as what I mentioned, sort of lack of coherent voices is one of the challenges. Experience of the past is that the EU typically takes small incremental path-dependent steps towards solutions. And so the question for the next little while is how does one govern the EU or the euro area without a full commitment to such deeper political and fiscal integration? What kind of institutional challenges will be needed? Changes will be needed. I'll leave you with that as a reflection, and I'll give you a little picture to close my talk. This is a vision of the future. There's this guy who's looking at, trying to do his lenses. This is the bankroet or austerité. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for holding out. I try in the end to talk about this question for which you were all here, right? Namely, do we go towards ever closer fiscal union? Thank you all for staying here and for David to invite me. And like Enrique Kenderlein, I think it's quite a good opportunity to come here and quite pertinent, because when you think about it, we meet here in the UK, a country with an oversized banking sector, dodgy finances if you compare it to Spain or such countries, and secessionist movements in the country, and yet it's fine and doing well. So in the end, I think we should probably need a queen at some point, because it's the only explanation why it holds together so well. I have a few printouts of this article on which this is based. It's a short article that really asks, where are we with European fiscal union, sorry. And what I argue in this paper, and this is the full argument on one slide, that is we already have something like a crypto fiscal union, namely through the ECB policy, a policy into which it was the bank was forced. It is, I call it through the monetary backdoor, and I specify a little bit what I mean by that. I said this morning to somebody that this in the audience that this is quite a paradoxical consequence of something that, say, the Bundesbanker holds so dearly and call it basically the taboo. Yet you should never kind of end this separation of monetary and fiscal policy on which the EU was built, the EMU was built, I should say, the singular independence of the central bank, not coordinating, not taking any advice from the fiscal side, although quite good at lecturing fiscal authorities. And I say this is now the part that it has been pushed into this quasi-fiscal role is a paradoxical consequence of this separation, because it doesn't have a fiscal actor that can play that role as you normally should when you have, for example, a financial systemic crisis with some insolvencies. Still, I do think this is an undesirable state of affairs for several reasons. First of all, quite frankly, it cannot do this job on its own. It's not stabilizing. Henrik has earlier talked about why the LTRO, also we thought this is finally the big bazooka, and it still hasn't done the job. It is also not legitimate for the reasons we all know. Fiscal debt should go through parliaments, but also, and here you may notice my German accent, I do think that fiat money has no backing other than the credibility of that that money is provided as a public good for a collective and not as a private good for the finances of the rulers, the private finances of the rulers. That's why we need such strong institutional guarantees that money is not printed at a whim of whatever the fiscal needs of the day are. And for that reason alone, we should take seriously that fiscal public debt should not be monetized easily. But you have to say we live in exceptional times, and therefore at the moment there is no other way out, and this is not only a problem for EMU, that's for all of them, but we need to find for the next crisis have something in place that doesn't push the ECB in such a role. The existing alternatives to that, in the disguise of these emergency funds that have been created, I think, will not stabilize markets. The argument is a simple one by Kindleberger, who has discussed at the breakup of Bretton Woods why the IMF cannot play this role that, say, for example, a world central bank could, or the Federal Reserve did until Bretton Woods broke down, because he says whenever you commit amounts, certain amounts, finite amounts in the advance, that will tip the hands of the authorities towards the speculators. A finite amount, like 500 billion, 440 billion, can always be tested. And it will be tested in financial markets in times of crisis, especially since the amounts are not terribly large. And this is exactly the Kindleberger proposition has been proved all over again. Therefore, call it what you want, and of course, because the Germans don't want to call it and have talked themselves into a corner and say Eurobonds not with us, call it what you want, but a Eurobond it will be, meaning a joint and several, that is, everybody guarantees everybody else's debt issue, but also each country is still liable, several liability, liable for its own issue. Something along those lines you have to have, and I discuss 3 variants, one of my own with a co-author. What you should, however, take seriously, and I don't find that in all these bond issues, and actually even in my own as I originally published it, the whole issue of democratic legitimacy. Somehow, when we have a Eurobond issue, we need to legitimize that, and it has to go the parliamentary way. And when I think about it, this new process, the European semester, that basically draft budgets have to go first to Brussels, that looks under certain guidelines that had been published before at the draft budget before they go to national parliaments. This is that new, quite astonishing process. That this European semester, this policy process that has now been implemented, could actually make sense in that respect, because I'm sorry, but I don't think that the European Parliament has the legitimacy to play that role yet, to be basically the one that represents European taxpayers. Why do I say that we have a crypto fiscal union? I take an article by Alan Blinder, the famous American economist, who said in a really excellent article about what quantitative easing is. He says, he discusses exactly when is monetary policy quasi-fiscal. And he defines it as saying, every monetary policy is quasi-fiscal that puts taxpayer money at risk, equivalent to investing government funds in risky assets. So that is, put money at risk that is equivalent to investing government funds in risky assets. I mean, this is a classic central banker's way of dividing things and assumes that monetary policy should always only come in when there is a liquidity crisis, while solvency issues in the end have to be taken up by fiscal authorities. And in a way, I agree with that. The problem is, in a crisis, you never know which part is liquidity and which part is solvency. And actually, it's a bit endogenous to how well you solve it, because if you don't get it under control, a lot of liquidity problems will become solvency problems. which is also the reason why you always need, in the end, the fiscal backing. Those who then say, well, we have to close down that institutions. What do we do with the claims against that institution, like deposits, pensions, entitlements with funds or insurances? And that is then a decision for, say, the welfare state in the widest sense, to make what is done with it. That cannot be done by a central bank, which usually also has way too little own capital to deal with these solvency issues when you really had a banking crisis. And the ECB fulfills two quasi-fiscal functions. It does finance government debt. It cannot do it through primary markets. That is, it cannot, like, again, this Zimbabwean central bank called the Bank of England. If you take our ECB speaker this morning, he always talks Zimbabwe, and I said, well, that's the Bank of England. It holds at the moment and buys 40% of all treasury bond issues directly from the treasury. So that is Zimbabwe in the eyes of Gabriel Glöckler. That is what the ECB cannot do, but it buys them quasi-directly through the S&P. It bought it and private bonds. It bought them through the securities market program, about which Henrik has talked quite a bit. But what it then has done, and that was my interpretation, is with the long-term refinancing operations, because of this whole debate of when I do securities market program, whenever then a debtor defaults, and I'm not sure Greece is the last one we have to discuss, then the political pressure starts on the ECB to also write down some of its debt, and then it would have to go cap in hand to the fiscal authorities and say, please recapitalize me. And this is certainly not a situation that the proud men in their gray suits want. And so they got off. That was my idea until I saw a bit more the point that Henrik made earlier today, why they want to replace this S&P program. But I guess the two arguments go together. So it has started with this big bazooka long-term refinancing operations, guaranteeing for 3 years funds at 1% interest rate. So basically, if the bankers are not totally rubbish, should earn quite a nice margin out of which they can recapitalize their balance sheets. It's called balance repair because recapitalizing is really, again, a quasi-fiscal function. And this is exactly what I think is done now by the ECB, and I think it has some reason for it. Now, by now you may think, oh, I'm one of these Germans who just blame the ECB for all the things it has done, never specifying what the principled critics would do, and I'm not one of them. I don't think this is the Eurosceptic's nightmare come true. The ECB was forced into this not because it was so opportunistic and just colluded with the fiscal authorities. On the contrary, it made it very hard for them for a very long time and had really to be pushed into it. It did what any central bank has to do, whether you write it in their treaty or not, namely to stabilize the financial system. That's the infrastructure through which it exercises its policy. Without a financial sector, it's dead as an institution. So no wonder they did this. It has the problem that it then also has to stabilize the sovereign debt, which it really didn't want to, but because of this fiscal financial loop about which feedback loop that, you know, the bad balances of the banks have become a problem have been turned over to the fiscal authorities, and the other way around in the case of Greece, where you start with bad debt and then the government bonds in the bank balance sheet create the feedback loop. And as I said earlier, the problem comes from that there is, and it was deliberately, no fiscal actor because of all this moral hazard and so on and so forth, which is still, I think, in everybody's mind, and I just don't see. I think it's one of the most overrated political economy problems that are spotted at the moment. Do you think any of those who stand by at the moment and see how the Spaniards, the Greeks, the Portuguese struggle, thinks, that is a nice thing to do, and then let the Germans pay, or the Finns, or the Austrians? This is such nonsense, absolute nonsense, in my view, that I would not even discuss it now. The ECB now forced with this, however, the spotlight is on the institution, no longer that boring central bank that it wants to be, has therefore started to pass this on to national central banks. So when you now have a clearly impaired debtor, like Greek banks that approach it with their dodgy bonds that they would like to hand in at the discount window, it cannot do that easily anymore. And therefore what it has done is pass it on to the national central banks that through various other instruments can still allowed to refinance these banks. And that is actually a legal way of how a transfer union, namely through the European system of central banks, that's what this ESCB stands for, has already been in the treaty, which these articles say basically, if the ECB, in bailing out systemically important national banks, incurs a deficit, it can be recompensated through the system of national central banks. If, in turn, a national central bank bails out a bank that is systemically important for the euro area, it can be compensated for that through the ECB or the European system of central banks. In other words, we already have something like a transfer union, namely in the case where in the exercise of your central banking lender of last resort function, you incur deficits. So where do we go from here if this is not a desirable state of affairs? The last bullet point basically meant we have a disintegration and a fragmentation, segmentation of the monetary union. And we hand back these unsustainable debts back on the sovereigns, because that is what you do if you give it to the national central banks. You give it to the national central banks because you know they are backed up by a fiscal hand. But we know that Spain is at the end of its fiscal space, so will be the Italians and you name them. Eurobond proposals have been actually discussed very early on. There was a group of basically bankers, the Giovannini report, a very short report that goes through the possibilities and among them discusses joint liability either through a community institution. We have with the EFSM guaranteed by the EU budget to the tune of 60 billion, something like that, or a single debt instrument, a newly created where we have joint liability form. And de Grauwe and Mösen bring that into the discussion. What they basically want to achieve is, in a liquidity crisis, to have guaranteed access, but at national rates. So you would have still this discipline from the financial markets. I myself do not trust in the disciplinary function of financial markets. Actually, I'm one of those who now bluntly says, and I know that you look like a bit like a dinosaur who doesn't believe in markets anymore. I do believe in markets, but not in financial markets in their disciplinary function for public debtors. They are basically pro-cyclical. They forget every warning sign that's there out there with respect to Greece when the times are good and growth rates high, and when a country goes into recession, oops, they wake up to the fact that perhaps this country has unsustainable debt and haunt it to destruction. So that must be stopped. That's why I would rather go with a Bruegel. This is von Weizsäcker and Delpa and so on, who have made this proposal to divide the issue of every country into red and blue bonds. By the way, de Grauwe and Mösen have no rule that you cannot access if you are beyond a certain debt level or something. There is no stipulation or conditionality on that. Bruegel says we must divide up red and blue bonds. Up to 60% are blue bonds, where you have guaranteed quota, and so you can issue up to 60% under the euro interest rate. And for the red ones, that is beyond the 60%, we organize kind of orderly debt default. We can discuss this, and this would obviously answer a lot of the headache that governments have at the moment, but I feel this is politically a non-starter. If you try and say we introduce Eurobonds in order to get rid of our past debt, this legacy, it's dead in the water. And quite right too. You cannot retroactively say that was not agreed on by the other national parliaments, your taxpayers have to pay for it. That much is true of what the creditor countries say at the moment. Therefore, I have no solution for the debt problem, I'm afraid. That is something which, between the ECB and the banking license for the ESM and so on, has to be worked out over the years. But we would say introduce a forward-looking Eurobond where we basically agree on the issue every year, depending on what we need for the policy mix with the monetary policy. That comes towards policy coordination, the issue that Charlotte has discussed earlier. However, I would say actually how much you issue, and you have no guarantee that you can go up to 60%, it may be less, but that you can issue and that we have differences in how much we issue is actually a sign of that it's properly done, because we have different fiscal space and different fiscal needs, we have different business cycles still. But you should give this public good of €1 interest rate. Yes, that is the promise for all catching up countries, for all the countries that still have some growth catching up to do. You should guarantee this €1 interest rate. And you can combine that with the European semester, because suddenly you would get an incentive for national parliaments to engage with it, because if they stay within the envelope that is agreed under this issue, then they can finance what they decide with a low interest rate. Otherwise, they're out in the wilderness, and everybody has the right to do that, but cannot expect solidarity when then things go wrong. And in that sense, it would give more incentives to actually comply with the rules and with governments to engage with their parliaments and the European processes. So far, we have the problem that we have not enough incentives for anybody to comply, because there's no payoff, just always Teutonic sanctions and lectures of what you should do and not do. This would give them an incentive to say, yeah, that is a club good that we all have to contribute to, and it's in all our collective interest. Thanks very much.
I wondered if fiscal policy hasn't worked in the past. What is the chance of it working in the future?
I have a very short question to Charlotte. The other two presentations we can discuss at a later stage. Charlotte, I had a point, at one point you mentioned that you were struck that outside the Eurozone, the countries with higher debt levels were more likely to introduce fiscal stimulus, whereas in the Euro area it was the exact opposite. If this is a finding which is solid, it's a very nice finding. I doubt it is a very nice finding. Isn't this driven by Ireland and Spain, which had very, very low debt levels, just statistically, which had very low debt levels, and then had to deal with the very large effects of their banking systems? In Ireland, we know the effect. In Spain, we know the effect. So don't you measure something like a fiscal stimulus, which in fact is just a budgetary effect from the banks, or did I misunderstand what you looked at?
No, I thought it was a superb way to end the conference prior to Bill Jameson's no doubt more negative portrayal of things, perhaps. But nonetheless, this idea that a Eurobond can work in conjunction with the European semester to create incentives does seem to raise the question, is the European semester enough? Are the measures of the six-pack enough in terms of binding fiscal measures, enough to, because we need incentives not only for governments in the south and the Euro periphery, we also need incentives for Germany, effectively, to accept the Eurobond. So what, I'd like to ask Waltraud, but this question applies to all the speakers, what modifications of the existing six-pack, the existing European semester agreed, would you like to see? Or do you think that it is sufficient?
I think only the last question was for me. Is that correct? So what modification? I mean, for me, I talk about policy coordination, by which I mean in the old sense, budget balances, surpluses or deficits, coordinated so that you get the aggregate stance of fiscal policy in the way you want it for the euro area as a whole. Now, that means sometimes, because we have still not synchronized business cycles, and actually that's a good thing, because it means we don't have to be so heavy-handed, for example, with the ECB. In my view, the euro area could make, if it has institutions that make actually something out of its diversity, it can be a positive thing that we are not all alike and have these boom-bust cycles where heavy-handed monetary policy is required that does a lot of damage to some regions and to some sectors of the economy. So if you then have this agreed envelope set for everybody, it is then still a matter for national policies to say, the structure of how, on what you want to spend it and so on and so forth, which taxes you raise or social security contribution. But the point is, you need the national polity to engage with it and to sanction that as well. And actually, I don't think, we often talk about the technocrats. Earlier, somebody was called, Steve Ryan, I think, was called a technocrat. And it always sounds as if governments and MPs are so engaged with, involving the citizens and so on. Actually, I think many member state governments have no interest whatsoever to have the national and the European processes very close up. They use the European level sometimes as a lever for processes they want to reforms and so on, because some European thing tells us that and so on. This would force them and give them an incentive, because they want to get this through Parliament, what they have agreed in this process, that they engage with their national parliaments and explain why the envelope is the way it is. So in that sense, I'm afraid on the whole six-pack and all that, this is all just more the return of the disciplinarian original intentions of the SGP, and it doesn't help at all. Yes, we cannot do unsustainable fiscal policies and all that, but that's not our problem at the moment. We need to get down of this, that those who had an SGP, like the euro area, and those who didn't have one, like the United States, we are all in the same boat on this. And yes, this will be a challenge for the next few years, but an SGP does just nothing to deal with that problem. It only creates pro-cyclical pressures.
The short answer to your question is yes, that this is not a very solid result as far as the non-Eurozone states are concerned, and it's especially because of what you said, because of the financial sector, which drives a lot of the increase in the debt levels. However, if you exclude a couple of those countries, you'd still get the same pattern of correlation. But I'd be happy after in the break to sit down with you, and I have Stata open. We can run a couple of more and change the specifications.
I'll try to answer two of the questions that were raised. So fiscal policy coordination didn't work in the past, and what would be a chance of it working in the future? And I think coming back to what Waltraud was trying to say regarding the Stability and Growth Pact, or the rules that have been set up for the member states to coordinate budgetary policies as a way to do that, because of the lack of a fiscal authority who has been delegated that role and who will do it on behalf of a sort of fiscal union, which we don't have. I think the relevance or the importance of prudent fiscal policies had not really been made clear. So the whole point of the Stability and Growth Pact at the time was the German electorate was very aware that this was an important thing, and they were worried that the countries of the South would not change their ways of how they dealt with fiscal policy, and that if EMU were to happen with these countries, because back in the middle of the 1990s, when the Stability and Growth Pact was first created, it was unclear which countries would be part of it. So it was an agreement that Germany in particular wanted to be put in place to safeguard EMU if, in the event that countries of the South would join in who have had that cultural experience of how one deals with fiscal policy. So that was where Stability and Growth Pact came from, right? Now, that was not clear to anybody else, unless you were living in Germany. This was not a concern. You go like, okay, well, whatever. But in order to make this clear to a general public, that governments will have to, make sure that they won't worry the Germans, that their budgetary deficit and public debt should be under control. A fairly simplistic system was created. Now, when such a fairly simplistic system comes in and gets criticized by everybody for being pro-cyclical and whatever, it becomes more difficult to implement such an arrangement, particularly when it's a fantastically booming period and people, seem to be getting money from everywhere, and it's just not such a big deal. It doesn't seem to crash. Now, I think, as we've seen also convincingly demonstrated earlier today, particularly in the Spanish case, not all problems come from debt. Not all problems come from excessive deficits. Some of the problems come from excessive deficits and excessive debt, but there are very many other problems that hadn't really been taken care of. More importantly, the excessively large debt was a real problem in the case of Greece, but the Stability and Growth Pact said, well, no single government can be held responsible for the debt of the size of the Italian debt or the Belgian debt. So instead of holding countries to account for having to deal with that large debt, we're just going to focus on the deficit. That's something we can explain to the people, and it's sort of like a disciplinary mechanism. So that's why Stability and Growth Act focused in particular on the budgetary deficit, and then also like the medium term, it should be close to balance or in surplus, because you do have that debt, and then there's the pensions as well. But so the point of the Stability and Growth Pact was make something fairly simple that you can explain to the people about what your government ought to be doing. If this doesn't work out well, there might be some horrific thing happening, but we don't know exactly what it looks like. Now we have the horrific thing. So now it's sort of a bit clear why one might want to deal with excessively large debt. Unfortunately, not only has that become clear, but there's lots of other mechanisms that were not put into the Stability and Growth Pact because they weren't really a concern to those who were trying to set up economic and monetary union in the middle of the 1990s. And in the boom years, it wasn't too worrisome to most people, because it seemed to be that those countries that were having these imbalances that we now find worrying were also the countries that were growing perfectly nicely. I remember when the European Commission said to Ireland, excuse me, but you guys are growing too fast, so maybe you want to just kind of, limit that a little bit. Everybody was like, cry wolf, this is ridiculous. But that's exactly what the macroeconomic imbalances story is now all about. Like, if you're widely out of whack in a number of these, 10 scoreboard kind of things, there is a risk of something going off. So is it enough? Are we doing the right thing? I don't know. I think they're making a half-baked measure that will try to solve the problems of today. My guess is that in the long run, we're still looking at deeper fiscal integration in both budgetary and fiscal aspects, so both the sort of keeping your budgetary deficit within a certain range, your public debt within a certain range, and if you are not prepared to have that, you must have a legitimate authority who will be able to do this on behalf of the collective. Then you can have quite a bit more flexibility, but you would have to have an authority that would do this for you. So where are we here? I think we're making this next step from where we were to where we might be going if one believes in sort of deeper integration. And if not, I think it's the phone number that Heinrich put on the board. There might be some alterations that one could phone to Merkel and say maybe we can think of that. But at this point in time, I think we're at that level, or we're coming to the next step, but we're not exactly sure if that's a steady state.
Sure. Well, everybody's keen on discipline. Who would the discipliner be?
Well, right now, we've just put, with the European semester, we've put the disciplining role on the European Commission, right? So in the last 2 days, we've seen the European Commission issue these convergence reports, right? And some people have actually been fairly critical that those reports are insufficiently disciplining, insufficiently critical. So we had sort of like 23 of 27 member states in the excessive deficit procedure. Germany's been told you're doing fine, you can get out of the excessive deficit procedure. And then there's Hungary, who's been told you're doing so well that we won't impose those fines, like monies from the regional policies that won't be given to you. They will be happily dispersed to you, don't worry about it. But we're not completely convinced that your long-term plans will be sufficiently good, so you're going to stick in the excessive deficit procedure for now, for us to be on the safe side that we have some control over you, but we will, disperse the funds to you. So some people say that the European Commission isn't really using to its full the instruments that have been made available to it. And we understand why the European Commission isn't fully using the European semester and the convergence report sort of disciplining factors that it could have, because it has to mediate this extremely difficult political minefield it's going through. If it now executes the role that we all would like the Commission to do, if the discipline is really what we're all about, then we see with the problem that I try to highlight in my presentation, we haven't really got that sort of consensus of collectivity, where all those member states will come together and say, oh, it's great what the Commission is doing, it's exactly the role we wanted to play, and that's its role, and we're going to also play its role. There's a chance that the member states will say, see, terrible Commission, they make us do these things in Brussels, and before you know it, the Commission is the bad guy. So that's the difficult balancing act.
Waltraud.
I would just briefly say, you said everybody's in favor of discipline. Well, I'm not. I think this is it is an unrealistic idea and actually also a dysfunctional idea, and I say that as an economist. We want governments to have soft budget constraints. They have it anyhow, because political decision mechanisms just never work as the threat of bankruptcy does. And in the end, that is the problem with sovereign debt. You cannot. A country is always more more worthwhile as a going concern than letting it go bankrupt. But we also want it, because this is the reason why we can do counter-cyclical fiscal policy. When no private actor wants to spend anymore, a government does. However, if there is at the same time, we should trust a little bit more in our democracies. There's now a lot of research about the conservative voter, fiscally conservative voter. I'm sure that will come in the next few years, and we have already seen it. The Iron Chancellor is suddenly a popular figure. Without it, if we don't have that, well, then forget it. The Commission, no Commission as powerful in the world will be able to impose that on sovereign entities. Not even federal governments are terribly good at imposing, they're not sub-national governments. So there must be a democratic consensus, and this is the role of coordination, coming to a peer review, coming to a consensus of what we really want. But I don't believe in any of these authoritarian ideas that we only would need to guide the right enforcement mechanisms. Democracy is an enforcement mechanism, a very imperfect one, but it is one. And the only one we have, I think.
No, the Stability and Growth Pact, in a way, is one-sided. It kind of it puts an upper bound on the it puts a bound on the spending from one side. But suppose you're in a situation that you'd like a country to spend more. How can the Commission enforce, let's say, if we now ask the Germans to spend more for the good of the Europeans? Is there any system that can be thought of, and is this feasible?
That was actually interesting during the crisis that prior to 2008, everyone said, oh, peer pressure is not working, there's no peer pressure because they're all in it together. But during the crisis, we actually saw peer pressure not necessarily working. I'm not saying that the Germans had this big stimulus package out of love for their neighboring member states, but still peer pressure was there, and I think it was very much felt in Berlin. So that was a situation where fiscal policy coordination had not only deal with the idea of having a ceiling, but actually encouraging member states to engage in fiscal stimulus. So the idea is that you could then free ride not only on member states' deficits, but also on free riding on them spending. Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think what happened after the crisis immediately was that everybody said, Bernanke is a big specialist of avoiding a big depression, and we have to spend our way out of this crisis. And it took very little for everybody to jump on that bandwagon, and very prudent countries or countries who had already high debt, everybody just spent like crazy. So I think that mechanism we have recently seen. So that is one of them. But the other one is simply this new scoreboard system. Like if a country has, like Germany or the Netherlands, Austria, the countries that are running a large current account balance, they're being basically told through the scoreboards of some of the things that are not perfectly in balance, and it gets communicated that way. Is it very successful? Was it successful in the case of Ireland? You're growing too fast, I mean, it's when it's on the counterintuitive opposite side, which is basically the balancing act, that people go like, it's laughable, what are you talking? But,
you know, in theory, those are the mechanisms.
The response of the Irish Prime Minister at that time was they said, oh, it's no surprise that people are falling out of love with Europe. And I could imagine the same being heard with the scoreboard. Yeah.
Although the scoreboard is a good example for that it can never be like, oh, it falls out of the scoreboard what we should do about the country, because what these 6 indicators there show you is there's a very different story to every country. But it is a good focal point for saying, so what is the most worrying, or 6 or 8, whatever.
10, I think even.
What is the most worrying indicator here, or do some indicators indicate an imbalance that one really should do? The problem is, of course, this is not easy to all monitor.
I mean,
I just want to see, what do you do about over-indebtedness of the private sector? Do you tell banks to slash their credits, or what? I mean, we're a bit short of instruments here, and therefore constantly to ask governments just to concentrate on consolidation of their debt. Well, what then does anything about, say, a current account imbalance that goes out of line? We have this twin deficit idea, so in principle you should then become more restrictive, but on the other hand, where do you then allow the deleveraging of the private sector if the public sector also wants to deleverage? We have to then all become export champions overnight or something. So these scoreboards are just signs that you cannot have these hard and fast rules, where when you don't hit the indicator, then you should be punished. But this is very much now the line that is taken, and I just hope that this fiscal compact will never be ratified.
Crypto fiscal policy, monetary policy is crypto fiscal policy. I was wondering if Waltraud could discuss Peter Bowfinger's proposal that the European Central Bank, and this is now a dated proposal from last year, actually target bond yields. So he's saying effectively Italian bond yields cannot go beyond a certain amount, can go no further, and then the ECB will intervene to prevent the yields from going. In effect, it's a kind of, again, crypto fiscal policy, but a different guise. And does that, these sort of proposals, that kind of proposal, does it have any credibility with you? Is it, I can imagine why it would be difficult for the European Central Bank to publicly set targets for different countries in terms of bond yields for different countries, and to justify the appropriate bond yields beyond which it would intervene.
I am not 100% sure. On the other hand, I mean, the reasoning behind it is sound. To say we have at the moment a situation where we do not allow the ECB to buy directly from the issuer. So in a way, while we give a guaranteed refinancing rate to the banks, this is a double standard. We do not help or guarantee, so to speak, the public debtor, who after all don't spend that for their private enjoyments, right? They do something for, hopefully most of it is spent on something more or less reasonable that should be spent. We do not guarantee them at which rate they can finance these public expenditures, while we guarantee, therefore, the banks more or less a margin that they can use without any stipulations that you can attach as a central bank to it, in contrast to a parliamentary recapitalization program where you could say, and so you do not pay out any obscene bonuses, which they do still. So in that sense, there is an asymmetry that something like the Bowfinger proposal would address. Now, I'm that much of an economist that I think it is problematic to target specific prices. After all, prices have a signaling and an information collecting function and so on. But it is something that needs to be discussed, and say the Swiss National Bank, and everybody applauded them for it and said, yeah, that's a sensible measure, targets another price, namely the exchange rate, which certainly the ECB should not do, because we have, there is something beyond the ECB and international global imbalances and so on. Therefore, it is worth discussing, but I haven't fully made up my mind, to be honest.
It seems it would begin to address some of the concerns that the fact that bond yields converge created a moral hazard within the euro area for countries in the euro area periphery, which traditionally had far higher bond yields. And some would argue that it was inappropriate that a country like Greece ever had a bond yield that approached German levels. And it was effectively a decision on the part of the financial markets that at the end of the day, Greece would be bailed out by someone, despite the provisions of the Maastricht Treaty. And so perhaps Bowfinger's suggestion is a mechanism whereby we can return to, on a semi-permanent basis, if not permanent basis, to divergent bond yields, which better reflect macroeconomic realities within countries, fiscal policy realities within different countries, while at the same time, perhaps in combination with Eurobonds, as you suggest, that a limited provision of Eurobonds, the countries can actually access some finances, if you see what I mean, some combination of the two schemes.
I mean, I would still, it is an alternative to the Eurobond, and while I also see this is a bit far off, although we may get it earlier than we think, not through the fiscal side, but through the bank resolution thing, which I think they soon have to make up their mind, because Spain is really too big to rescue. But it is, to me, a second best solution, because in principle, a central bank should have its interest rate policy not to make public finances easier or whatever, but in order to stabilize the economy. And so this can only be a temporary mechanism, now that you ask me that way. But at the moment, there is an asymmetry of how easy it is made for the banks to try and get out of their calamities, which they really have, and not anything to relieve the public creditors, debtors from their calamities. And that is addressed by the Bowfinger proposal.
No one? Okay, well, thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much to the panelists and to the questions. Certainly, fiscal policy coordination has improved to some extent. It might even improve more, but starting from a very low base. So, you know, there is room for improvement, so we'll have to wait and see. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you.